After the end of the Second World War in 1945, the world stood at a dramatic crossroads. The devastation of 6 years of total war had left Europe in ruins, millions dead or displaced, and economies shattered. Yet out of this devastation, two superpowers emerged in a position of unprecedented strength: the United States and the Soviet Union. These two powers had been allies of necessity during the war, united against the Axis powers, but their alliance had always been fragile, held together by the immediate need to defeat Nazi Germany and Imperial Japan. Once the common enemy was gone, the deep differences between the two began to surface. The United States was a capitalist democracy that championed private property, free markets, and political pluralism, with an emphasis on individual liberties. The Soviet Union, in stark contrast, was a one-party communist state that promoted collective ownership, centralized economic planning, and the guiding role of the Communist Party. Each side saw itself not merely as a nation-state defending its interests, but as the representative of an ideological system destined to shape the future of humanity. This clash of worldviews meant that coexistence would be extremely difficult. Suspicion between the two had existed even during the war. Stalin resented the Western Allies for delaying the opening of a second front in Europe until June 1944, long after the Soviet Union had already borne the brunt of the fighting and casualties on the Eastern Front. On the other side, many in Washington and London distrusted Stalin's motives, especially as the Red Army advanced westward and liberated, or occupied, vast territories in Eastern Europe, tried to address the shape of the post-war order, but they also revealed the seeds of discord. While the Allies agreed on the division of Germany into zones of occupation and the establishment of the United Nations, the fate of Eastern Europe remained contentious. The Soviet Union insisted on having friendly, pro-Soviet governments in countries like Poland, Hungary, and Romania, which it considered vital to its security buffer. The Western powers, particularly the United States and Britain, emphasized the importance of free elections and democratic self-determination. This disagreement would quickly escalate into confrontation. By 1946, the sense of division was becoming unmistakable. Former British Prime Minister Winston Churchill, in a famous speech in Fulton, Missouri, declared that an iron curtain had descended across the European continent, separating free nations in the West from those under Soviet domination in the East. Churchill's words captured the growing awareness that Europe was no longer united but had entered into two separate spheres of influence. The Soviet Union, meanwhile, tightened its grip on Eastern Europe. Communist parties, often backed by Soviet advisors and security forces, consolidated power in Poland, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Bulgaria, and elsewhere. Opposition groups were suppressed, and coalition governments gave way to single-party communist regimes loyal to Moscow. In the United States, the policy response began to take shape in 1947. President Harry S. Truman announced what became known as the Truman Doctrine, a commitment to support free peoples resisting subjugation by armed minorities or outside pressures. Though couched in general terms, the doctrine was clearly aimed at containing Soviet influence. Its first test came in Greece and Turkey, where communist movements and Soviet pressure threatened to destabilize the region. The United States provided economic and military assistance, signaling a new era of active American involvement in global affairs. This was not merely a defensive strategy, but a declaration that the United States would assume the role of global leader in opposing communism. The same year, Secretary of State George C. Marshall proposed a vast program of economic aid for the reconstruction of Europe. The Marshall Plan offered billions of dollars to help rebuild industries, infrastructure, and livelihoods across the continent. Its underlying purpose was not only humanitarian but also strategic, to prevent the economic desperation in war-torn countries from driving populations into the arms of communist movements. Western European nations embraced the plan, and it became a cornerstone of their recovery. The Soviet Union, however, rejected it outright, denouncing it as an attempt to impose American influence, and it forbade Eastern Bloc countries from participating. The result was a clear economic split between Western Europe, increasingly prosperous and integrated under American sponsorship, and Eastern Europe, bound to the Soviet system of centralized planning and state control. In response to the Marshall Plan and the emerging Western alliance, the Soviet Union established the Cominform in 1947, a coordinating body for communist parties across Europe. Its purpose was to enforce ideological orthodoxy, strengthen loyalty to Moscow, and suppress any deviations such as the independent path taken by Yugoslavia under Josip Broz Tito, which was soon expelled from the organization. This step revealed how determined Stalin was to maintain absolute control over the Eastern Bloc, even at the expense of alienating former allies. The atmosphere of mistrust deepened in the late 1940s. One of the first major confrontations came in Germany, which had been divided into 4 occupation zones. The Western Allies sought to merge their zones and introduce a new currency to stabilize the economy, while the Soviets feared this was a step toward creating a separate West German state. In June 1948, Stalin attempted to force the Western powers out of Berlin by blocking all road, rail, and canal access to the city, which was located deep inside the Soviet zone. The Allies responded with the Berlin airlift, supplying the city by air for nearly a year, until the blockade was lifted in May 1949. The episode demonstrated both the willingness of the United States to confront Soviet pressure and the determination of the Soviets to test Western resolve. It also symbolized the division of Germany and of Europe as a whole. By 1949, the division of the world into opposing camps was institutionalized. The Western powers created the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, NATO, a military alliance linking the United States, Canada, and most of Western Europe in a mutual defense pact. For the first time in its history, the United States committed itself to a permanent peacetime alliance, a dramatic departure from its earlier isolationist traditions. On the other side, the Soviet Union consolidated its dominance over Eastern Europe through bilateral treaties and, a few years later, through the Warsaw Pact. At the same time, the nuclear arms race began in earnest. The United States had demonstrated the power of atomic weapons at Hiroshima and Nagasaki in 1945, and for 4 years it maintained a monopoly. But in August 1949, the Soviet Union successfully tested its first atomic bomb, shocking the West and shattering the illusion of American nuclear supremacy. The prospect of nuclear confrontation added a new layer of danger to the already tense relationship. Meanwhile, in Asia, the balance of power was shifting as well. The Chinese Civil War, which had raged since the 1920s, ended in 1949 with the victory of Mao Zedong's communist forces and the proclamation of the People's Republic of China. This was a major triumph for the communist camp, and it alarmed Washington, which now faced the prospect of a united communist bloc stretching from Eastern Europe across the Soviet Union to China. The perception of a global ideological struggle was becoming unavoidable by the early 1950s. The division of the world into 2 opposing systems was not only political, but also economic, military, and cultural. Propaganda on both sides painted the conflict as a battle for the soul of humanity. Americans were warned of communist subversion at home and abroad, while Soviet citizens were told that imperialist encirclement threatened their socialist motherland. Both sides invested heavily in espionage, intelligence, and psychological warfare. Trust had evaporated almost completely, replaced by an atmosphere of suspicion, competition, and fear. The stage was thus set for the first direct military clash of the Cold War, which broke out in 1950 on the Korean Peninsula.